Welcome back everyone. On the heels of my last video, which was a tutorial on how to sew a turtleneck, I've created a variation of that same pattern, which is a two-tone turtleneck with a diagonal seam. This two-tone turtleneck sewing pattern can be purchased as a PDF download from the link in the description below. The pattern is for a close-fitting turtleneck and comes in sizes men's extra small to 2XL. This video is a step-by-step sewing tutorial on how to assemble the pattern. If you are new to sewing stretchy knit fabrics, I don't recommend starting with this pattern. Instead, I suggest you check out my video tutorial on sewing a t-shirt, which includes a free pattern, and the tutorial is geared for beginners. First, let's talk about some important details of the pattern. If you need guidance on how to print out and assemble one of my PDF sewing patterns, please check the description below for a link to my separate video. The pattern pieces we have for this design are as follows. We have the upper front, the upper back, and the collar, all of which I will be cutting in brown. We have the lower back and the lower front, which I will be cutting in blue. These pattern pieces are actually a mirror image of each other, but so you don't get confused, I do suggest using both of these pattern pieces. And we have one sleeve pattern piece. We will be cutting one sleeve of each of the two colors. Please note the long arrowed lines on the pattern pieces. These indicate the direction of greatest stretch of the fabric, which may or may not be the same as the grain line of the fabric. Also, please note the small tick marks on the outer edges of the pattern pieces. These indicate notches, and you should place a tiny snip in the fabric here because this is a spot that will be matched to something else during the sewing. Next, let's talk about fabric selection and cutting. This sewing pattern is designed for four-way stretch, lightweight jersey knit fabrics that have a spandex fiber content. Because of the close fit of the garment, I don't recommend using any knit fabric that has less than 50% stretch. Some possible fabric options are cotton jersey, ITY knit, brushed jersey, or sweater knit. Regardless of the fabric type, it is important to select something that has a high amount of stretch. The fabric I'm using for this tutorial is a brushed jersey knit, which can be purchased online from Fabric Wholesale Direct. And I will leave a link in the description below so you can order some for yourself. With the two different fabrics, there's a lot of room for creativity here. I estimate that you will need about 1 to 1.5 yards each of two fabrics to complete this pattern. A few important things I'd like to note about the cutting. It's very important that while you are cutting all the different pieces for this sewing pattern, you should always have the fabric facing right side up, and you should also have all the pattern pieces facing right side up. It's very easy to make a cutting mistake on this pattern if you don't follow those rules. Also, I cut all the pattern pieces on a single ply of fabric. Let's start by cutting our upper pattern pieces, which are the upper front, the upper back, and the collar, which I will be cutting out of brown fabric. Make sure you place a tiny snip on each of the notches, which can be found at the armholes, at the neckline, and there are two along the diagonal. The collar has 2 notches. Don't forget the notches on the second upper as well. The notches on the diagonal are especially important. Now let's move on to the lower pieces, which I am cutting in blue. At first glance, you may think that the way I have these pattern pieces laid out is wasteful. But again, I advise you to cut using all the pattern pieces, have the pattern pieces right side up, and have the fabric right side up during the cutting. While I was sewing practice samples for this pattern, I realized very quickly that if I didn't follow those rules, it was very easy to cut something wrong. Finally, let's cut the sleeves. I will be cutting one sleeve each of the 2 colors, so I will have one brown sleeve and one blue sleeve. There are 3 notches that should be snipped on the sleeve cap. With the cutting complete, these are the pieces we will have: an upper front, upper back, and a collar, all of the same color, 2 lower pieces of the contrasting color, and 2 sleeves, one of each color. The first step in sewing is the diagonal seam between the 2 colors. All the seams going forward will be stitched at a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Let's start by assembling the turtleneck front. Lay the pieces right sides facing along the diagonal line. There are 2 notches along the diagonal, and it's very important that you match these with sewing clips. After you have the edges matched at the notches, then you can place a few more sewing clips along the seam. Be careful to make sure that the layers of fabric are relaxed and that you aren't stretching them in any way. You will notice that the upper layer of fabric overhangs the lower piece of fabric by a little bit, and that's totally okay. Diagonal seams are a bit strange, so trust the process and just know that this isn't how it's going to look when you finish sewing the seam. Let's head to the serger and stitch this seam at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. As you start to serge this seam, let the overhang of the top layer be just as it is. Don't try to match up the starting points of the fabric. If you've ever made bias binding before, you're going to be very familiar with how this diagonal seam works. But if you're not familiar with it, you're going to have to trust me and just know that the starting point of the seam, the fabrics don't have to match exactly. Along this seam, be extra careful not to put any extra stretch on the fabric and simply allow the machine to pull it through. It's very easy to get a wavy or distorted seam here, and that's exactly what we don't want to happen since it goes right across the front of our turtleneck. As you approach the end of the seam, be mindful that, again, these points are not going to match. Just continue serging along and off the fabric. As long as you matched the notches on the seam and you didn't stretch either of the fabrics, when you open up the seam, you will have a matching edge. Now, since I know that this diagonal seam is prone to waviness or distortion, I'm going to go press it with some steam before I even open it up. If you are using synthetic fabric like I am, best practice is to use a press cloth so the heat of the iron doesn't damage the fabric. The back pieces of the turtleneck are going to go together much the same as the front pieces. Just make sure to match up the notches with sewing clips first. With both diagonal seams stitched, here's what the front and back of the turtleneck will look like. If you get a slight mismatch at the seams at the shoulder points, don't despair too much. When you stitch the shoulder seams together, this little bit of a discrepancy will disappear, and it won't make much difference on the finished product. If the mismatch is, say, a 1/4 of an inch or more, I'd probably consider ripping out the serging and redoing the seam. Now, before we move on to stitching the shoulder seams, we need to stabilize them. Cut narrow strips of fusible knit interfacing and press them to the wrong sides of the fabric along the shoulder edges. Note that on this front piece of the turtleneck, I'm going to make sure the seam allowance of the diagonal seam is fused toward the blue piece. Do the same thing to the turtleneck back along the shoulder edges on the wrong side of the fabric. On this piece, I will make sure the diagonal seam allowance is fused towards the brown. This way, we will be making sure that all the bulk of the intersecting seams of the shoulder doesn't end up all in one spot. Place the turtleneck front on the turtleneck back, right sides facing, with the shoulder edges matching. Now let's head to the serger. I'm not too worried about using sewing clips on the shoulder seams because they're pretty short. On the shoulder with the diagonal seam, match the intersecting seams as best you can. You will see that we made this easier by fusing the seam allowances in opposite directions so that you can butt up the bulk of the seams against each other. Before we attach the collar, let's turn the torso of the turtleneck right side out along the shoulder seams. Now we want to serge the collar into a tube. Fold the collar in half, right sides facing, and we're going to stitch together the sides that do not have notches. Next, roll the tube back on itself so that wrong sides are facing and that the remaining raw edges of the collar match. This will enclose the seam we just created, and you will be matching the notches of the raw edges. Now, we have a finished collar. Next step is to attach it to the torso of the turtleneck. Before we do any sewing, we need to make quarter points at the raw edges of the collar and around the neckline to aid us when we go to the serger. To find the remaining quarter points on the raw edges of the collar, lay the collar flat with the seam line and the notches of the raw edges matching, and place a tiny snip on the left and right folds of the collar. To mark quarter points on the neckline of the turtleneck, match the center front and center back notches and walk the raw edges of the neckline together. This will create a fold on the left and right hand sides somewhere below the shoulder seam where you will place a tiny notch with your scissors. These quarter points are very important for when we go to attach the collar to the raw edge of the neckline because they will help us equally distribute the stretch of the collar. Next, we will reach inside the tube of the collar and pull up the torso of the turtleneck inside it so that we can match all three edges in the round. Place the seam line of the collar at the center back of the neckline and use sewing clips to match all four quarter points around these edges. Don't be afraid to be too fussy here, making sure that everything is matched up nicely, because the collar seam is probably the most difficult seam of this project. Now let's head to the serger and stitch together these 3 raw edges in the round. Important step here. Before we attach the collar, turn the stitch length on your serger down some. I'm going from a 3 to slightly below a 2 stitch length for this seam only. The reason here is that we want this particular seam to have extra dense stitching, thereby giving it extra stretch. We need the neckline seam to be able to stretch a lot so that you can pull the turtleneck over your head. After attaching the collar, make sure to return to your normal stitch length. The opening for the neckline is fairly small, so if you have a free arm option on your serger, this would be a great time to use it. We're going to serge on in the round, starting near the back of the garment where the seam of the collar is located. This seam may be a little awkward because the neck opening is so small, so take your time here and carefully adjust the raw edges to make sure they are all matching as you stitch around. You will need to stretch the collar slightly to match it up to the quarter points of the neckline. But if you can help it, try not to put any additional stretch on the neck opening of the torso fabric. This seam is the most difficult part of this whole garment, so take extra time and caution here to make sure you get the best result. As you come all the way back around the neck opening to where you serged on to your fabric, overlap your starting serging by about 1 inch or so, and then you can serge off the fabric. The neck seam is tricky and easily will get a distorted seam, so before I even turn the turtleneck right side out, I'm going to head to my ironing board and press this seam with some steam to smooth out any slight imperfections. Now, with the collar attached, let's turn what we have so far right side out and open it up flat with the collar in the center so that we can see one entire armhole. For this project, we will be doing a flat sleeve insertion where we attach the sleeve cap into the armhole before we stitch the side seam and underarm seam. Lay out flat the matching color sleeve so that the sleeve cap corresponds with the armhole. Let's note the 5 points that need to match when we stitch in the sleeve to the armhole. The corner points are matching point number 1, The second point is the second notch. The third point is the shoulder seam to the notch at the top of the sleeve. The fourth matching point are the notches on the opposite side of the armhole. And the fifth point is the corners on the opposite side of the armhole. Keep all 5 of these points in mind as we attach the sleeve to the armhole. Flip the sleeve onto the torso of the turtleneck so that right sides of the fabric are facing. And now we will walk the sleeve cap along the edge of the armhole and use sewing clips to match the 5 points we just discussed. There are various different ways people attach sleeves into armholes, but I will show you the way that I most commonly use. I start at one of the underarm points and I have the sleeve cap facing the feed dogs of the serger with the armhole of the turtleneck on top. Placing one hand underneath the top layer of fabric, I will use my fingers to draw in the more curved sleeve cap edge to match the armhole as the fabric goes under the presser foot. Remove the sewing clips as you approach them. For this particular sleeve, there is no front half and back half. The sleeve is the same on both sides, so it isn't possible to insert the sleeve in the wrong direction. Since you are matching together 2 different curves, you have to keep in mind that as you insert the sleeve, you're going to have to stop frequently to reposition before you sew the next small section. Continue stitching until you reach the underarm point on the opposite side of the armhole, and then serge off the fabric. Repeat the process for the second sleeve in the opposite color before moving on to the next step. With both sleeves inserted, we will now move on to the side seams. Let's start with the seam that only has one color, the blue side in this case. Fold the turtleneck in half so that right sides of the fabric are facing along the shoulder seams and matching the hems. The side seam and underarm seam will be stitched in one continuous pass. Match these raw edges starting with the intersection of the underarm seam using a few sewing clips. I prefer to serge on at the wrist and continue my pass through the underarm to the hem of the turtleneck. Reminder, all the seams for this pattern are stitched at a 3/8 inch seam allowance, or 1 centimeter, which is a standard serged seam. For this long seam, be careful not to apply any additional stretch to the fabric as it is stitching. Just allow the serger to pull it through the machine. Also, keep the weight of the turtleneck up on your sewing table so it doesn't create any additional drag on the fabric. As you approach the intersection of the underarm seams, place the seam allowances in opposite directions and butt them up against each other to get a perfectly matched seam. The second side seam is completed much the same as the first, except this time you have two sets of intersecting seams to deal with, one at the underarm seam and one at the seam where the colors switch. Similar to the point at the underarm seam, at the point where the colors switch, place the seam allowances in opposite directions and butt them against each other to get a perfect match. Take extra care to get a good match here, since this match is on a highly visible part of the turtleneck. The final step in assembling our turtleneck is to do the hems. The hem allowance for this project for the bottom of the turtleneck and the sleeves is 1 inch. The way I mark my allowance for my hems is to use a piece of tailor's chalk and a gridded drafting ruler. On the inside of the turtleneck and the wrong side of the fabric, I mark a chalk line 2 inches up from the raw edge. When we fold up the hem to the inside of the garment, this line is where the raw edge will meet. Mark a line 2 inches up from the raw edge on the front and back of the turtleneck torso, as well as the fronts and backs of the sleeve raw edges. My go-to stitch for sewing stretchy hems is this 3-step zigzag stitch that I have circled here on my machine. Keep in mind that there are many different ways to do stretchy knit hems, including using a cover stitch machine for the most commercial look. The method I'm showing you here is what I feel is probably the easiest, and it also takes into account that most home sewers don't have a cover stitch machine. Make sure to do a sample of your hem stitching on fabric scraps to test for the appearance and stretchiness before you use it on your finished garment. Using a 3-step zigzag stitch with a chalk mark, I typically don't use pins or sewing clips on my hem unless it's a particularly difficult fabric. Working from the inside of the turtleneck, all you have to do is fold up the raw edge of fabric to meet the chalk line and run your stitching close to the raw edge of the fabric. My preference is to start stitching near one of the side seams instead of directly on the front or back of the turtleneck. You may need to level out the presser foot using a folded up index card or something similar to get over the bulk of the side seams. but definitely what I wouldn't do is put a lot of extra stretch on the fabric to pull it through. Stitch all the way around the hem and continue to fold the fabric so that the raw edge meets the chalk line, and don't apply any stretch during the stitching. After stitching all the way around, overlap your starting stitches by a small amount. The sleeve hems are done the same way, except you will have to use the free arm of your sewing machine because the wrist opening is so small. Start and end your stitching at the seam in the sleeve, and you will likely have to give your machine some extra help to move the fabric through the machine, depending on how snug the sleeve fits on your free arm. Keep in mind that when you go to hem your second sleeve, which is a different color, you will probably want to change your thread to match the new fabric. The last thing to do after stitching is give all your hems a good press with steam to make the edges nice and crisp. This concludes the video sewing tutorial on the two-tone turtleneck from Carl Wesley Sewing Patterns. As always, if you have any additional questions or need additional help, please drop a comment below and I will do my best to help out. If you enjoyed this video, a like and a subscribe are always appreciated, and I hope you will stay tuned for my new sewing videos and new pattern releases. I'll see you in the next video, and happy sewing!